Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
The country forced to endure their division and chaos. The longest episode of EastEnders ever put to film.
So Keir Starmer there mocking the Conservatives and their divisions during PMQs at the beginning of this year. Have we switched from EastEnders to Coronation Street? Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Carroll Hepker.
And I'm James Woolcock.
Look, the reason I make that joke, I know it's a bit lame, James, to talk about Corrie and soap operas, but it's because of this Bloomberg exclusive. Our Westminster lobby team have discovered that in the last 2 weeks, in the run-up before the budget, senior ministers have written to Keir Starmer expressing alarm at the spending cuts that their departments are facing. 2 weeks ahead of the budget, it has made a huge splash. The story leads the Today programme on the BBC, Politico's Westminster newsletter, and then the Times newspaper late last night wrote that they think that the ministers involved are Deputy Prime Minister Ailbhe Rea in her role as the Housing Secretary and the Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood and the Transport Secretary Louise Haigh. So they name names.
And look, you often hear around the budget stories of unhappy ministers or unhappy aides, people who are getting less money than they'd hoped, putting unhelpful lines into the press. But this story has made such an impact because a formal warning to the Prime Minister going over the head of the Chancellor 2 weeks ahead of the budget really does ring alarm bells. And I mean, also picking up the story, because it has gone everywhere around Westminster, Sky's political editor Sam Coates tweeted late last night that he reports that the departmental spending budgets for some departments haven't yet been agreed. So there are two agendas in conflict here. One is the Chancellor's determination for Labour to be seen as fiscally prudent. And on the other hand, you have ministers who are concerned that any cuts will lead to growth and potentially even make the public's lives miserable.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, really, isn't it? And so I'm delighted to say that we have joining us the lady behind the scoop, Bloomberg's Ailbhe Rea, one of our reporters who broke this news, to give us some more details, insight, perspective, Ailbhe. So what do we know so far about these letters, what they've been, why they've been written to the Prime Minister and why these people are so concerned ahead of the budget?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Caroline. Yeah, so what we have reported is that multiple members of the Cabinet have written directly to Keir Starmer, as you say, expressing their alarm about cuts that they're being asked to make to their departments in the budget that's happening in just under 2 weeks' time. We haven't named the ministers involved, although you mentioned some of the names that the Times has tried to identify. I'm not sure that it's limited to only those people, actually, but we're not naming them. The concern of these ministers is that these cuts are essentially just politically untenable, that they will be counterintuitive to Rachel Reeves' growth mission, that they will lead them to breaking manifesto commitments and failing to deliver on promises that they made to their new voters at the last very recent general election. There is really quite a lot of alarm among the ministers and even just stepping away from the letters themselves that have been written to Keir Starmer, which is a bit unusual, even though Downing Street says that this is all normal. It is, as James was saying, actually a little bit unusual to be writing to the Prime Minister going over Rachel Reeves' head in this way. But just stepping back from those letters, it's actually just something that we reported even before this story, that there's quite widespread Cabinet unease about the eventual look of the budget, and not just from the Cabinet ministers that you would expect it from, but really quite widespread across the Cabinet. You know, Rachel Reeves has said that she needs to plug a 22 billion black hole, and Financial Times first reported that she's looking at making savings of up to 50 billion in the budget to give herself just basically enough headroom. So they've been quite clear that they think this is, an issue with the Tory inheritance, and that this budget will be tough. But definitely, even though I think there's an effort to pin this on the Conservative inheritance, there's still actually a lot of unease in Cabinet about where these exact spending cuts will fall.
So what can you tell us, Ailbhe, about what was in these letters? What were these ministers so concerned about? What did they want Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, to do about it? And what did they say the consequences would be if action weren't taken?
I can't go into too many specifics without revealing exactly which letters we've seen and which departments are kind of affected. But in broad brush strokes, I mean, you can imagine that people are identifying particular areas of departments where they think that there is an acute issue and where they think that they cannot afford to make cuts or make cuts as deeply. But I think the broad brush criticism is that these are just ridiculous. Is the word that I've had from several other people using the word alarming. That just these cuts are politically impossible to deliver, not just in terms of announcing them in the budget, but actually the real world impact of them on communities, on infrastructure, on public services in a few years' time, that members of the public will feel the impact of these cuts. And it's just not deliverable for a Labour government to do. I think that's the main criticism. I think also a criticism that actually, even though Rachel Reeves says that she's going for growth, certain cabinet ministers think that certain cuts would just be counterintuitive to that mission.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, isn't it? I was chatting to Bloomberg's chief UK economist, Dan Hansen, this week. He says that he thinks that actually what you're going to see is spending and taxes going up at the same time in this budget. He was talking about departmental spending will need to rise. You know, when you think big picture overall, because you know, we know inflation in the past has gone up and we know that there's so much pressure on, you know, things like wages, you know, for public sector workers and so on and so on. But that actually also taxes are going to go up at the same time, and that changes to the fiscal rules are going to mean that you have higher capital spending as well. I mean, it's kind of weird, isn't it? It feels like this could be an austerity budget, and yet everything's getting more expensive. And so the government's got to pay more.
Yeah, I think that there's some concern in government about the way this change to the fiscal rules has been trailed. As you say, we've been given a lot of hints by Rachel Reeves and other ministers that she will tweak the spending rules to allow her to invest more in capital spending. And that's been taken as a kind of good news story quite broadly across government. But I think that the issue is that has led to the impression maybe that the budget won't be quite as tough as it really will be. And this is, I mean, getting into the weeds a little bit, it's basically because there are several fiscal rules. And so changing that one means that in the longer term, there will be more money for capital spending and for investment. But in the short term, especially in the first year of the budget, that won't make so much of an impact. And there are other fiscal rules, which mean that for this year, which is the year that cabinet ministers are most worried about, actually, things will be really tight. And actually, for the first year, it's just going to be cuts rather than lots of investment. I mean, one person described, who's quite sympathetic to the Treasury perspective on this, just described it as, you know, a first-year nightmare, and then, you know, things look a bit better in the third or fourth year of the budget.
We use the word austerity there. Obviously, that conjures up an image of George Osborne and what he tried to sell to the country as why it needed to do it. You've also got some reporting on how political aides are talking about this budget, Ailbhe. How are Labour trying to frame the narrative around it? If this is as tough as your reporting suggests, how are they trying to talk about it to the public?
Yes, so listeners will be aware that there has very recently been a reset in Downing Street. Susan Gray, the former Chief of Staff, is out, and Morgan McSweeney, a long-standing aide to Keir Starmer and the campaign chief for the general election, is the new Chief of Staff in number 10. He's seen as pretty politically savvy, and he wants to bring the number 10 operation onto a sort of permanent campaign footing, so to always be thinking about the next election and how they hold on to their new voters. As you mentioned in our reporting, we mentioned that there's a weekly meeting with all the special advisors in government that happens on Tuesday evenings. This week, Keir Starmer addressed it, which is also a bit unusual, plus Morgan McSweeney and Darren Jones, who's the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and he's the person that the Secretaries of State have been negotiating with on their pay settlement. So he's been at kind of front line. He's had a pretty difficult job in government so far. They held the meeting on the theme of how to sort of frame the budget politically. They said that it would be tough, but that Labour just needs to hammer home the message the budget is all about investment, and also that they've just really need to pin the difficult decisions on the last Conservative government. That even if individual secretaries of state are concerned about how tough it will be, that actually it's not to be blaming Rachel Reeves or Darren Jones for. It's all on the Conservative inheritance that they've been left.
And the great difficulties. I mean, in terms of your sense of this new government, I mean, we're only sort of 3 months in, 100 days in. This is going to be one of the first big, huge tests, isn't it? The budget after we had the investment summit only a few days ago. Do you think we're going to see more division within Labour? Everyone talks about one of the big pluses for Labour being their stonking majority, but this hints at, reveals maybe the fault lines, the divisions within this ruling party?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's hard to know how visible those divisions will be. I mean, we've already had a very big sense of it with this story and all this reporting around the budget. I'm not sure how much it will keep appearing in the papers, but those divisions are very, very much there. Sort of become a running joke. People I've been speaking to sort of joking about how bad they are at government. and like from multiple people across the Labour government in different ways. And yeah, lots of frustrations. I think people are just on slightly different pages. We saw that around the investment summit a little bit. The workers' rights agenda, the call for more investment, pulling in two different directions. Even, it's probably too much in the weeds to get into, but if you look carefully at the announcements coming out of the government every day, with the so-called grid, where they plan their big announcement every day, some of them are a little bit contradictory, and people in government are aware of that, and that, one day they might be anti-regulation and the next day they're in favour of a new regulator for something. It's not super joined up, and before Sue Gray was forced to resign as Chief of Staff, lots of people were complaining that there was just a lack of overarching political narrative from Number 10 and just a lack of story about the big thing that this Labour government was fighting for. Sue Gray's gone, but that narrative isn't necessarily still there. I think that there are different cabinet ministers who think that this government is for different things and they have different priorities, different values, and we're really starting to see that, I think.
Our UK Associate Editor, Ailbhe Rea, thank you for coming on and telling us about your big story.
Yeah, of course. And we'll have full coverage of what does emerge in the budget and all the days running up to it as the pressure on the Chancellor Rachel Reeves and the Prime Minister Keir Starmer remains firmly in place. Thank you so much to Ailbhe for spending some time with us. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Sean Rastamakia. I'm James Woolcock.
And I'm Caroline Hepker, and we'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg. And I'm Caroline Hepker, and we'll be back with more on Monday. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.